I'm Stephen Pfeiffer. I'm a research fellow here at CSAC, and I'll be moderating today's session of the European Security Initiative. We've talked in this series a lot about the security challenge that Russia poses to the West. And I don't think that there's any country that has experienced quite the variety of security challenges from Russia as Ukraine. Political subversion, economic boycotts, energy cutoffs, and since 2014, they have been the victim of attack by both Russian and Russian proxy forces, both which seized Crimea, and also a continuing conflict in Donbass, which has, over the last 6 years, claimed about 14,000 lives. Now, the United States has regarded Ukraine as a partner going back to the mid-1990s, but one of the things we're going to talk about today is what is the current situation in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and then how is U.S. policy responding? Where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, and what might be recommendations to improve that policy? And I am delighted that we have today Ambassador Bill Taylor to speak with us. Ambassador Taylor has 50 years of public service, beginning as a platoon and company commander in Vietnam. He was on the staff in the Senate, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, came to the State Department in the early 1990s. He held ambassadorial rank at the end of the 1990s as the assistance coordinator for the post-Soviet space, went on to serve then in Jerusalem, Baghdad, Kabul, U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. And then last year, when he was the executive vice president of the U.S. Institute of Peace, was recalled and asked by Secretary Pompeo to go back to Ukraine for 6.5 months as the chargé. And of all of the ambassadors or the American ambassadors to Ukraine, he has several things that are unique. But the one thing that's unique is he's the only American ambassador who has ever jumped out of a Ukrainian helicopter twice with Ukrainian airborne forces. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Taylor.
There you go. Steve, thank you. Thank you. Very good. Steve, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Mike, Catherine, Brett, Chip, the whole team here. This is quite an impressive group. I've got some friends here that go back 50 years, Steve. There's some classmates of mine from the military academy or represented, but they're the ones, some of the ones with ties on. Steve told me that when he was inviting me out here, that I could wear a tie. But I would be the only one in the room with that, and that's not true because I have some friends here that have this. So yeah, I will be glad to say a little bit about this. I'm sorry this is obstructed view here. There are some people back here that I will try to remember. But fortunately, Emily has given me this mic that allows me to kind of walk around so I can try to see folks. But it's exactly as Steve said. Ukraine, I want to argue in the first part of this conversation that Ukraine is on the front line. It's not just on the front, it's on our front line. The reason we should care about, the reason the United States should care about Ukraine and should support it is because it's on the front line of all of those battlefields that Steve described. I mean, the Russians in their hybrid warfare against us and against the West more broadly have chosen a lot of different battlefields. And Steve mentioned a couple of them. The obvious one is when they invaded and now illegally occupy Crimea is the military battlefield. And as Steve said, I was in Ukraine for the past almost 7 months, and was able to go out to the battlefield to see that front line. And as Steve said, there are people dying. There are Ukrainians dying on that front line every week. When I was there most recently, it was in December, there was a Ukrainian killed and about 3 Ukrainians wounded. This happens, and so here we have in Europe, a hot war, which we should care about. And we should care because, again, they are on our front line. It's not just the military, but that's the most obvious one. Steve mentioned energy. The Russians are trying to build a pipeline from Russia to Germany that will increase the dependence of Germans and Europeans more broadly on their gas, on Russian gas. It also deals a big blow, a heavy blow to the Ukrainian economy by bypassing Ukraine. It's not just on the military front, it's not just the front line there on Donbass, they also attacked the Russians, dropped all pretense a year ago Thanksgiving, and attacked Ukrainian Navy in international waters near the Kerch Strait, near this Kerch Bridge, which the Russians have built to try to connect Russia to Crimea. And as I say, a blatant attack of one nation against another, unprovoked. The Russians have hacked into infrastructure. They've hacked into Ukrainian infrastructure, and they've attacked into ours. They conduct information warfare against us and against the Ukrainians. And these series of battlefields remind me of Tim Snyder's book, where his road to unfreedom, Timothy Snyder's road to unfreedom, starts in Russia. And it goes into Ukraine, and it goes into Europe, and it comes to the United States. And so the best example of that, I think, for me, is the election interference. And again, if it starts in Russia, the unfreedom starts in Russia, and people here who know Russia better than I, like Ambassador McFaul and Catherine and others, Chip, Steve, all these people who've actually served in Moscow for a long time, know about Russian elections. I mean, it's a sham. And that's unfreedom in Russia, and it starts there, but doesn't end there. The next place they go, and that place they went, a couple of interferences in other Ukrainian elections earlier on, but in 2014, after they had occupied Crimea and had invaded Donbass, and the Ukrainian president fled to Russia, they had a presidential election in 2014. I was there. I was an international observer at that time, and just checking in with the group over here on the side, the obstructed views here, the obstructed viewers, and so we'll be sure they're not asleep here. That's right. But in 2014, the Russians attacked the Central Election Commission, the Ukrainian Central Election Commission, and interfered, almost tried to change the outcome, tried to change some election outcomes, and they almost did. But the Central Election Commission in 2014, Ukrainian figured out about an hour before the announcement was made, they were able to identify the problem and correct the problem, and announce the outcome of that election, which President Poroshenko won in the first round. It was the only time the first round win. But the Russian press continued to report the illegitimate, the hacked, the interfered with results, and they said that the right sector candidate, this neo-Nazi party, far right, I don't know what neo-Nazi, far right party, had actually won. And the Russian press put that out, and they, of course, had to back down on that. So that was 2014. 2016, Brexit. There was Russian interference there. 2016, we don't have to talk, we don't have to give any evidence about the Russian interference in the US election, which has been extensively examined and investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee, by the Mueller investigation, clear Russian interference. We've indicted some Russians for that interference. Again, start in Russia, then into Ukraine, then into Europe, and then into the United States. And we also know, we've read in the past 3 weeks, that the Russians have already been identified in the 2020 election. So this is the road to unfreedom. This is Timothy Snyder's road, which Ukraine is on the front line. And here, that's the kind of the first theme here, is that that we should support them because they are on the front line, and it's coming this way. there are some ways that Steve mentioned that there may be some ideas about what we could do. And there have been some people giving a lot of thought. So Institute of Peace, we were doing some work with Steve and with Brookings and with Atlantic Council and others about how to come up with some ideas, some solutions, some ways to get the Russians out of Donbass. And that effort led to some kind of good ideas on that. And there are some. I want to argue, Steve and I were just having this conversation earlier today. I want to argue that Donbass, the solution to Donbass, one of those battlefields that Ukraine's on the front line, is we could solve that. We could do some things. We could take some steps. It would start off with putting some people in charge of that effort in the U.S. government, and that to actually push that forward. But that could be done. As many of you know, Ambassador Kurt Volker had that job. That is the job of the negotiator, the U.S. negotiator trying to focus on Donbass. He wasn't in this Normandy format that is the four, the Russians, Ukrainians, the Germans, and the French. But the United States, through Kurt, was an active participant and pushed things forward. And Kurt's ideas, some of which we had worked on with him and kind of fed into Kurt, were on the table and are still on the table. Kurt's gone, and there's not a replacement for Kurt. So that's one thing that we could. There are some policy things we could do, but you need someone to drive it. You need someone in the government to kind of to be the center to push on that. There's some possibilities. Economic and travel sanctions, other sanctions. We used to have Dan Fried, Ambassador Dan Fried, who was the sanctions coordinator. Sanctions coordinator in the State Department, but he was also the coordinator across the government. And Dan pushed hard for those sanctions, and not just in the U.S. government. He would go to Paris, and he would go to Brussels, he'd go to Berlin. He would push for the Allied support of these sanctions, and he got it. And much to Mr. Putin's surprise, the Europeans have stuck with those sanctions, and they have to reauthorize them every 6 months. That's hard. That is hard for them. The Europeans have to kind of bite that bullet every 6 months. That's a hard political task. But Dan helped them, and I think Putin is surprised that those sanctions have held on. And I think Catherine and I were talking about the effect of those sanctions on Russia. It's serious. Anders Alston says it's 1% of GDP a year. That's a lot if you think about. That's a lot, and I want to argue, and Steve and I disagree on this, I want to argue that Putin would like to get out of those sanctions. We probably agree on that. The question is whether or not he wants to get out enough to deal on Donbass. And I say yes, and Steve says no, but we can talk. We can talk. We can talk about this. This will be good. But those sanctions are really important. We had somebody in the government to push those, and we don't now. That would be important to do. The security assistance, the famous security assistance we learned a lot about the security assistance, how it works over the summer, but that also needs the kind of push from the Defense Department and the State Department. There are two components of that, and both the state and defense have to push forward on those, and the people who have been doing that are slowly leaving. Or keeping their heads way down on doing that. The overall U.S. government position on Ukraine, again, Ukraine's on the front line. It's on our front line of our freedom. The overall policy has been coordinated by the National Security Council. Know something about the National Security Council, and the people there. John Bolton was I disagree with him on some things, but I certainly agree with him on his attitude, his policies, his steps on Russia and Ukraine, and he's gone. Fiona Hill, well known to this group, incredible expert on Russia and incredibly brave person, very articulate. You probably saw her last fall. She's gone. Her replacement, Tim Morrison, also gone. Alex Vindman, still in the army, but he and his brother are no longer at the National Security Council. These people were professionals. They were professionals. They were not political. They were not pushing one side or the other. They were pushing for a strong U.S. policy in support of Ukraine because Ukraine's important to our security. This is what they were doing. This is why they were so important. In Kyiv, we haven't really had a confirmed U.S. ambassador since last May, since Masha Yovanovitch was abruptly pulled out. We've had a couple of chargés, and the current chargé, Christina Kyiv, is very good. Professional Foreign Service officer. She's doing a great job. There are people still in the State Department. There's a DAS who's doing a super job. He knows Ukraine well. But what you really need is an ambassador out there, and you need the kind of support that I just described here. So Steve and I have had this conversation. I've been working, as Steve said, at the United States Institute of Peace actually ever since I came back from Ukraine in 2009, with a brief break in service to go back into the State Department to do Arab Spring, but basically been doing that. And in the last couple of years, I've been working on Ukraine policy and have made some suggestions along with Steve and John Herbst and others along the lines that I've just described. Minding my own business at the Institute of Peace, making these policy recommendations from the comfort of right across 23rd Street from the State Department, when I get this phone call saying, Bill, hypothetically, this is in the court in May, just hypothetically, would you be willing to go back out to Ukraine to be a chargé? And I said, hypothetically, glad to. The next day, another phone call, same guy. It's no longer hypothetical. Will you go? Will you be willing to go? And I said, well, okay, let me do some checking. So I checked with my wife, and she famously said, don't go. She said, don't do it. By the way, I just heard from the Vindman's wives that there is a hashtag for wives whose husbands don't listen to them. And the hashtag is, we are all Mrs. Taylor. So she said, don't go. I got advice from a mentor, a guy that I had worked with closely for a long time, worked for in earlier times, and he said, Bill, if your country asks you to do something, you do it. Brett knows this story. If your country asks you, do it if you can be effective. And that last clause there, if you can be effective, was important. And he said, you need to determine, you need to ask that question. Before you say yes to going back out to Kyiv, you should ask this question. And the only person who's going to be able to answer that question is the Secretary of State. And so I went to see him, went to see Secretary Pompeo, and told him that the only way I could go out, the only way I could be effective as the U.S. representative in Kyiv was if the strong support for Ukraine continued. Because as people in this room who have made foreign policy for the past 20 years, the United States has supported Ukraine on a bipartisan basis across administrations, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, the State Department, the Defense Department, the National Security, the Justice Department. Bipartisan support, because of what I just said in terms of the recognition that Ukraine's important for our security. That was there. And if that strong support for Ukraine were to continue, if I could be assured it would continue, then I would accept and I would go out. And he assured me. And so I did. And I told him that if it should change, that I would have to leave. I would have to come back. And so he gave me the assurances that I need. I went out. I got there, and the embassy was upset. The embassy was concerned. The embassy had just lost their ambassador. Ambassador Yovanovitch had just been pulled out, and They didn't know why. I didn't know why. I, knew a little bit, but no one could really explain why Ambassador Yovanovitch was pulled out so suddenly and abruptly without explanation. So I couldn't answer that question. But what I could do was have a big discussion, much bigger than this room. The U.S. Embassy in Kyiv is large, as Steve knows. It's about 900 people. There are about 600 Ukrainians and 300 Americans. And a lot of them were in this room when I got there to have this conversation. And I had kind of three messages for this big town hall. And the first was, we are here, we, the US Embassy in Kyiv, we're here at an important time in the history of Ukraine. New president had just been elected. He had just been elected. He was about to go into a parliamentary election. He had just won with 73. He had won his presidential election with 73%. No one gets 73%. He got 73%, an overwhelming mandate. He called parliamentary elections. He won 60% of the Rada, of the seats in the parliament. No government had ever been formed without a coalition. And so he didn't need a coalition. He could form a government on his own. So he had great potential to do some things. Both on the two big priorities were the war and defeating corruption. And he could do some things because he had the presidency, he had the prime minister, he had the cabinet, he had the Rada. He could do some things. So this is an important time for us. It's an important time for the United States to be able to be there, help him, encourage him, nudge him in the direction that we thought and we think would make sense from our standpoint, but we think it would help him as well. This is what we do. And so it's an important time to do that. So that was my first message. The second message was that we do have, the embassy out there, we've got strong support in Washington. And again, they were a little worried about that. You could understand why they might be a little bit worried about that. They just lost their ambassador. Nobody could tell them why. There were all these political things swirling back there. So when I told them, which I truly believe, and I think it is true, that is, we do have bipartisan support for supporting Ukraine. That was part of the reassurance. And again, I told them the same business about Republicans and Democrats and over successive administrations. And the third thing I said was, we can't let politics get in the way of what we do. We don't want to get involved certainly don't want to be involved in American politics. Back home, let them do all that. And there were some political messes that happened in Kyiv all the time that we don't want to get involved in either. Let's do our job. I said that was the message that we got. So we got started. We got to work, and that was the thrust, and that was the enthusiasm, and that was the effort that we were making out there. And kind of partway through the summer, well, I could see the full range of our support, and the full range. The full range of our support includes, diplomatic support, political support, economic support, financial support. We had security assistance. We were helping the reform efforts. All of that went forward fine. That's what I call the regular channel. That regular channel is all those people I talked about earlier in terms of back in the State Department, Defense Department, NSC, all those people. That's the regular channel. The U.S. policy is made by that regular channel, supported by the Congress. They appropriate funds to operate and implement those policies. That's the regular channel. Through the summer, started to become clear to me, and I'm a slow learner, but it started to become clear to me that there was another channel, channel that I call the irregular channel. And this irregular channel was led by a private lawyer. And people in this room know who I'm talking about. Yes, in particular, these people know who I'm talking about. That is good. So this private lawyer, I will sadly say, with the help of two well-meaning diplomats, had a private channel had an irregular channel going on. And the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian government, the people that I was working with, were confused. They heard one message from me and the regular channel and all of the work that we were doing with them. And then they also heard something a little bit dissonant, a little bit unusual, a little bit odd from this irregular channel. I don't have to tell this group all the details of that. If anyone wants to know the details of that, I can refer you to some testimony. But let me just say that the regular channel, in the end, last fall, reasserted itself. And the security assistance that had been held up by this irregular channel got reinstated and began to flow again. And even though all of it didn't get obligated in the last of the fiscal year, the rest of it did in this fiscal year. So that moved forward. Our two presidents met. President Trump, President Zelenskyy met. And this all happened because the regular channel, up through the Secretaries of State, Defense, and the National Security Council, and the Senate, bipartisan Senate pressure got that irregular channel turned off. And the regular channel reasserted. So I want to argue, last thing, and I'm almost done here, Steve, and I will sit down. And I want to argue that this regular channel is important. It's part of, now this is the boring part. So I'm going to check to see if anybody's still awake over here, because this regular channel is the institution. It's the institutional conscience of foreign policy. It's an institution that has norms, it has ethics, it has responsibilities, it has roles for all of us. All the people that I mentioned that are in that regular channel, they're there because they have a role to play. Whether it's in the Defense Department, whether it's in the State Department, whether it's in the embassy, whether it's in the National Security, there are roles in this institution that form the policy. And in this case, it's a policy toward Ukraine. But there's a broader institutional, and it's a conscience. And it keeps us on track in some, it's unwieldy sometimes, this kind of interagency process, we sometimes call it. And it's cumbersome. And sometimes it's hard to get Treasury on board if you got a great idea and Treasury is resisting. They won't put sanctions on, you have to convince them. Or you got the Justice Department, and there are a couple of bad guys in Ukraine who have violated US laws that we would like to see the Justice Department investigate. But that's hard, but nonetheless, that's the institutional channel. That's the institutional conscience of US foreign policy, which I think we should defend, and it can be defended again. Last thing, and I've got 1 minute left, and that is, again, going back to Tim Snyder. Tim Snyder wrote The Road to Unfreedom, which I talked about, that unfreedom starts in Russia and comes towards us. But he also wrote, about the same time, on tyranny. And he's got these 20 lessons that people should read. This is, I think, another important book. And the second lesson is defend institutions for exactly the reasons that I just said. This is a defense against tyranny, and I think we should do that. So I'd be very glad to answer your questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this, Steve. Thank you very much.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for that introduction. Great start. I think there will be lots of questions. But
I hope.
Let me hit you with the first question.
Okay.
Okay. When I was in Kyiv in November, visited you,
Yep.
Ukrainians were nervous.
Yep.
And the question was, we're watching what's going on. We're watching people like Bill Taylor testify to Congress. And what does this mean for the depth and resiliency of U.S. support for Ukraine? Because I think in Ukraine, there is this sense that, sure, their goal is they want to be a normal European country. But Germany can't be the counterbalance to Russia. France, it's the United States. So, by the time in January you left, what was your sense? I mean, were they more confident? Were they nervous? I mean, how do the Ukrainians see their standing in Washington now?
So they are nervous, and you picked it up exactly right. They were nervous, are nervous, for all the reasons that I just said. However, I could tell them that on the specific issue of the security assistance being put on pause until certain investigations get done, I could tell them that the strong support for Ukraine, which they do need, and they recognize they need, they love to have the support of the Germans and the French, but it matters if they have the Americans with them when they negotiate with the Russians. So they do need us. And I told them that on that security assistance, to get that reaffirmed and resumed and flowing again, it had the strong support of the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, and everybody below them. That was not at issue. The importance of that assistance and the signal that it sent. It's not just the sniper weapons. It's not just the counter battery radar. It's not just the night vision goggles. It's not just the training that we do out in the western part of the country. That's all important. But what's even more important is the signal it sends to the Russians that the Americans are there. The Americans are there not just in statements of support. We're there seriously helping them in their preparation to fight the Russians and in their fight with the Russians. And it's a true statement that all of those people supported the resumption of that system. So there's that. And I would tell them that there are, and they're sophisticated observers. You saw that, Steve. They watch what's going on in Washington very carefully. And it helped them to hear explanations that I give, which I also gave to my embassy, our embassy, which is, in Washington, there are 2 Ukraine stories, which they heard and they were picking up. They heard the one big Ukraine story. And the big Ukraine story, the loudest Ukraine story, is whistleblowers and Giuliani and corruption, and that's a very partisan story. And the impeachment, that's obviously very partisan. And in that story, Ukraine's the object. Ukraine's not the subject. Ukraine's the object in that story, and that's in that very partisan story. There's another Ukraine story in Washington. This is what I would tell my Ukrainian friends, and that is, Ukraine is fighting the Russians. Ukraine is trying to defeat corruption. Ukraine is trying to join the EU and NATO. Ukraine is the subject. That's what Ukraine's trying to do. It is the subject of that story. And that's the story that people were starting. There's a lot more Americans, probably everybody in this room well aware, but there are a lot of Americans that I would have this conversation with, and they say, what? The Ukrainians are fighting the Russians? There's a war in Europe? 14,000 people have died? People are astounded. A lot more people today, based on those hearings last fall, know about the Ukraine story, and they are ready to support. So I think, and that's somewhat reassuring to the Ukrainians when they hear that.
Okay. All right, well, let me open up the floor to questions. Name, affiliation, and a question mark.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here today. I'm Ian Palmer. I'm one of the National Security Fellows over at Hoover. My question goes to the provocation that you alluded to a minute ago. On the one end, once in 2014, the Obama administration approved non-lethal aid to Ukraine after the Russians invaded. The Trump administration has increased that a little bit to include lethal aid with caveats. You just talked about EU and NATO membership. I think somewhere in there is the right balance. I'm just wondering, how far do you think we can push with our support to Ukraine before it becomes provocative to Russia? And
so I'm not, frankly, I'm not so concerned about provoking Russia. What I am concerned about is defending us. And we defend ourselves by defending others, like the Ukrainians, on the front line of Russia. It's the Russians who are provocative. It's the Russians who invaded their neighbor. It's the Russians who continue to provide troops and weapons and funding and leadership in Donbass, in part of a sovereign country next to them. That's provocative. That's what I'm worried about. I'm less concerned about provocative. And I think it's the right thing. I think the Trump administration did the right thing of providing lethal weapons, which the Obama administration didn't do, for fear of provoking. You're exactly right. And it was the right thing to do. And the Ukrainians are now buying more of those javelins at the end. I know this man, Tom Ramos.
Guilty.
Yeah.
So you may recall, I'm a member of the Army Science Board, and we were getting briefings when the Russians started invading, and what I saw of the Russian invasion astounded me. And it was a full-blown war invasion, clearly. Following that, and then it seemed to me, my perception was there seemed to be some of the air or some of the momentum seemed to stop. And maybe it was simultaneous with the Syrian, now the incursion into Syria of the Russian troops. And my question then to you is, from your perspective, when I was trying to put two and two together, I didn't think the political aims of the Russians had stopped. I thought they still had the same goals. And I was trying to understand that, and I was beginning to think, well, perhaps the sanctions were having a particular kind of effect that it limited the extent of how far the Russians could go. And if they suddenly now had a commitment to Syria, then they were unable to satisfactorily, say, commit political goals in that. So my twofold question to you is that, am I on the right track? And then if so, from your perspective, how do the sanctions work? What part or how were the sanctions working? How important is it for a united NATO sanction to come in? And what form should that take to have the most effect in keeping Russia kind of being less provocative?
Thanks, Tom. It's good. I'm going to let Brett talk about the Syria angle. He knows something about this. He knows something about this, and the Russian angle on that, Brett. So you're on for this. But I will try to answer the first. On a couple things, Tom. One is I think you're right that Putin didn't change what he wanted out of his invasion and his support and troops and all in Donbass, because he wants control of. He wants to be able to affect the foreign policy and probably international economic policy of Ukraine, and because he doesn't want Ukraine to succeed. He doesn't want his Russian people to see a successful neighbor country, brotherly neighborly country, succeed in a democratic form, in an economic form, in a political form, joining the EU or joining NATO. He doesn't want to see that because he's worried that what it means for his own, his Russians may say, hey, if the Ukrainians can do it, why can't we? So that's one of the big concerns about that. And that didn't change. And he thinks he's able to have that control, dialed up, dialed back, as you said, with what he's got going in the southeastern part of Ukraine. That is the LNR and DNR, the two little statelets that he's put his own people there running. And we can talk about whether or not we can get them out, but it seemed like to me what he wanted to do. And the sanctions, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think it surprised him. He had not gotten big sanctions. Mike can talk about what we did after Georgia and the sanctions after that conflict. And he probably thought, well, I can live with those sanctions, with the sanctions we put on, or the actions that we took after Georgia. And so he wasn't constrained by that. He certainly wasn't constrained by that. And when he went into Crimea, similarly, I mean, we put some sanctions on individuals who had something to do with that decision. But it wasn't dramatic. So he went further, and he thought he could, again, with this dialing up, dialing back, this kind of reestablish, he could affect the part of Luhansk and Donetsk that would have an effect on the foreign policy and the defense policy and the international economic policy in Kyiv. So he could do that, and he was getting that kind of results. He was surprised, I think, that with the severity of the sanctions that the international community, led by the Americans, led by Dan Fried, put on after that. Now, the Europeans came on a little slower than we did after Donbass, but when the Russians shot down that civilian airliner and killed 198 people, civilians, the Malaysian airliner, many Dutch and many Europeans, the Europeans came on with the sanctions as well. They came on, and these were sectoral sanctions. They were on energy and finance and dual-use weapons, and those are having an effect. And as I said earlier, that economists take a look and see how much they're having a real effect. And I think that surprised him. And I think that may have also, Tom, Brad, I don't know if you want to talk about the Russians and Syria.
I think all I said is relevant in our talks with the Russians on Syria, almost 3 years of talks. They never, we were always ready for them to put other issues on it. Yeah. I don't want to get off track, but in talks with the, you're talking about kind of the, how Ukraine might be related to Syria and what Putin is doing. In all of our talks with the Russians on Syria, interestingly, they never put other issues on the table. We were always ready. They might kind of, hey, let's do a trade, something in Syria for Ukraine. We always had Russia experts in our delegation. Colonel Binman was with us in one of these rounds, but they never did that. So it's kind of I think Putin sees them as separate. In Syria, it's basically to ensure there's no regime change to support Assad. Erdogan will be in Moscow on Thursday. So this is how this has been playing out the last few years. I think Syria is going exactly better than Putin could have even wanted when he went in terms of just regaining his stature in the Middle East, unfortunately. But I never saw it as I think they kind of saw it separate. I don't know if you.
No, I saw the same, Brett. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Mike. Michael Paul Stanford. One question about Ukraine, one question about us. So give us your assessment of the new president. The new government, he's got a new chief of staff. Maybe he has a new prime minister since I've been in the meeting all day today.
Wait till tomorrow.
Wait till tomorrow. But just, you got to know him. Tell us what you think of him.
Yep.
And how will we know if he's succeeding or not? Can you
Yep.
give us some metrics that we should be watching for, particularly on Donbass?
Yep.
And he said some pretty big things on that. What do you think's happening there now that Surkov's out of the way? Is there an opportunity? And what would be some things you could say, oh, he is succeeding, that we could all watch? On your observations about the US government, I can think of two hypotheses for why we have nobody in place. By the way, Morrison was also replaced, and that person also was replaced. You left, I'm forgetting his name, but
Yeah, Pete.
he didn't last too long.
Yeah, Andrew Pete.
Andrew, right. He's gone now too. So there's.
But he had no Russia background or
Correct.
no Ukraine background.
I know.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I know. I'm just not gonna. I'm not gonna talk about. I realize we're live on TV here. So two explanations. One is this is just kind of normal Trump administration slowness and appointing people, and there's nothing to see here, and they'll eventually get all the people in place. But a second explanation is that no, actually, they don't want to have a lot of activity right now. They don't want to have a big initiative with respect to the normal channel of policy. So what's the right way to understand why there's so few people working the account today?
Good, good. Zelenskyy. If you haven't watched Servant of the People, it's on Netflix, and it is subtitled. And it's just, I think it's still just the first season. It's worth your watching because you'll get a sense of this man. So Zelenskyy, the president, in this series, Servant of the People, a television show, plays the president of Ukraine. And he addresses some of the issues, Mike, that in the show that he's now addressing in real life. In particular, the fight against oligarchs, and in particular, the fight against corruption within his government. And it's amazing to watch. He's very smart. We know comedians in our country that are very smart. They're very quick and charming. The idea of both the regular and irregular channels to have the two presidents, Trump and Zelenskyy, talk was a good one because I thought, and so did Kurt Volker and Gordon Sondland, that if they did talk, that they would get to know each other and they would work together, and the US-Ukraine relationship would be stronger, and we'd be able to provide more support to them in their defense, in their fight against the Russians. Because he is a smart, charming, engaging, focused person. So now he doesn't have deep background, obviously. He doesn't have a deep bench, and get into your question about people. His chief of staff, Andrei Bogdan, was the lawyer for one of the most troubling, possibly damaging oligarchs, corrupt oligarchs in Ukraine right now, which is a major challenge to Zelensky's presidency. And this guy was the lawyer for 8 or 9 years to this guy. But this guy Bogdan was also a driver on some of the reform efforts. He was the only one on the kind of shallow bench that had government experience in previous times. I mean, most of the people that Zelenskyy brought in, he knew from childhood. The head of the SBU of his security services was a childhood friend. I think they met in like 2nd grade or something. And others he had worked with in the Servant of the People is the name of the television show. It's also the name of his political party. And there are people who he brought from that organization, Quartal 95, from the production company. So this guy did have some ability to get things done, and he was getting things done. And there were serious reform measures taken with, as I say, he's got full control, the parliament and the government, and he got some big steps done. Just as an example, every president in Ukraine's history has tried to get rid of parliamentary immunity, which was in their constitution. And every president said, oh, this is a source of corruption because oligarchs get elected, they buy their way into the parliament, and then they're immune. Nobody can go after them. And so Zelenskyy, within like 3 weeks of establishing his government, got the constitution changed, and today the parliamentarians are being prosecuted. So he and Bogdan was part of that. So his departure, I think, is a mixed message. It's a mixed story. And the new guy, Yermak, has a track record. I mean, this guy has actually struck some deals, this gets to your question about Donbass, struck some deals with the Russians. One of the big deals he struck was a prisoner release. And I will tell you, the Saturday, that the prisoners came back from Moscow and got off the plane at Boryspil at the airport in Kyiv, was a national holiday. It was a spontaneous national holiday. People around the country were focused in on this. It was live on TV. People around the country came into the squares and they were celebrating and dancing and singing. And they cared so much about these soldiers, about these 24 sailors, as well as others that were released, that it was that big a deal. And Yermak was part of that, was the negotiator on that. So he's gotten some things done. He's now the chief of staff. Some people say, no wonder he got that deal with the Russians. He's too close to the Russians. So people are, we'll see. And as Steve says, we'll stay tuned and see. Prime Minister Bogdan, the strong chief of staff who's now out, had effectively chosen Goncharuk, the prime minister up until now. Strong reformer, brought in other reformers in his cabinet. Young, 35, not great experience, but what experience he did have, it indicated he had a track record of supporting reform. And we're worried, as Steve says, that maybe the day tomorrow, sometime soon, he could be, I think there's is it a cabinet meeting tomorrow? Cabinet meeting tomorrow.
President speaking to the Rada.
So the reading of the Rada tomorrow, and we may see that there's a change in the prime minister, and the people who are being thought of being the new prime minister are kind of older people, people who have not such a great track record of supporting reform, Tipko and some of these others. Although there's this new person that I've never heard of who's also who's a candidate. Anyway, which to be determined. Your question about succeeding. He's got 2 top priorities, and one is Donbass and getting the Russians out, and the other is defeating corruption. And so I think we should hold him to not hold him. We should look to see if he achieves things in those 2 areas. He has, with Yermak and others, he's had more conversations with Putin than Poroshenko had over his whole time. And Putin is actually dealing with him not equal to equal, but certainly with respect. which he didn't do with Poroshenko. So he's made some progress there. Some people get worried about that. Oh, he's too close. But nonetheless, there's some progress there. He's got Yermak on the case. He doesn't yet have the foreign ministry in that, which is too bad because they could bring some things on that. But that's the first thing. The second one is on defeating corruption. As I said, he's got some track record already with parliamentary immunity. The previous administration, to give them their due, Poroshenko set up some institutions, some courts and some prosecutors to go after corruption, but Poroshenko didn't staff them or staff them with people that weren't going to follow through. Zelenskyy has put good people in there. Now, a couple of the good people that he's put into the new prosecutor general and this National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU, are under attack right now, and they could be swept out in some of this changes to the parliament. So that's another milestone. That's another checkpoint that we should walk. The two explanations for the U.S. government slow to replace or don't want to do anything. I don't know. I don't know. Other people in this room may have a better sense. I know.
You don't know, nobody knows.
No, that's certainly not true. I know that they've been trying to get a confirmed ambassador, get a ambassador nominated. They've got a person in mind, and all the vetting has been done, and they just need to get that person to the Senate, which they haven't done. They've had other things on their mind. I understand the White House has been busy. But that'll be an indication as to whether or not they can get it. And then it will be good to have a new Fiona or a new Tim Morrison or a new Andy Peake or somebody there, Alex Vindman, to kind of lead that interagency process. And that, I think, will give us an indication of which of those things we're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. I wanted to ask about the question of disinformation and information warfare, as you put it. In combating disinformation from the U.S. side, from the Ukrainian side, where do you see the chief bad effects of what the Russian information campaign in Ukraine is doing? So is it polarization? Is it loss of trust in public institutions? And based on that answer, where do you think the most effective place to focus a response would be? So is it kind of trying to convince everyone to trust the government more? Is it focusing specifically on Russians in southern, ethnic Russians in southern eastern Ukraine? Is it protecting data and critical infrastructure so it can't be hacked as easily, or something else?
Probably all of the above. It doesn't help. But on your question about how do they do it, I mean, this is now pretty well established. They do it the same, again, just like Tim Snyder says in The Road to Unfreedom. They try it in Ukraine, they do it here. So they've done those, they identify cleavages, they identify splits in our society and arguments and challenges that we have, and exacerbate them. And they can do it both ways. I mean, they can do it, whether it's on a racial issue, and they can come at it from either side of the racial issue. And it doesn't, they have no dog in the fight about the racial issue, but they just want Americans to distrust each other or be angry at each other and those kind of things. So it's that kind of, and then I think the answer to your question about how to counter that, as well as in the United States as well as in Ukraine, is, and this is hard, is encouraging readers, consumers of information, and consumers of news to challenge everything they hear. Challenge and this is an education process. But challenge the news, whether they think it's fake or not. We're doing some work on that. The U.S. government is doing some work with the private sector, and I think that's and I think we have to do that both in this country and in the southeastern part of Ukraine.
Ambassador Taylor, I'm Mandy DeBelfish. I'm a predoctoral fellow here at CSAC. Just to follow up on Professor McFall's question, I'm curious about Zelensky's relationship with his military, particularly the two priorities you laid out, Donbass and corruption, seem both like they could be avenues of great cooperation between a government and the military, but also terrible conflict. Do you think his relationship with them is with the military is secure, or do you see observations of fracture?
So it's a very good question. So far, it's been a very good relationship. He's got a very good Minister of Defense to start with. Now, Steve made me a little nervous this morning by reading off a list of cabinet ministers who might be changed. Zagornyuk, the defense minister, is on that list. So I'm hoping that he's not changed because, in answer to your question, they've got a very good relationship. Zagornyuk is, he's never been in the military, first of all. He's been in the Ministry of Defense, and in particular in the Ministry of Defense Reform Office, and is very committed and very enthusiastic and energetic. He's brought in new people, he's fired old people, and he's got the support of the president. So that's a very good relationship. He's also got support of the chief of the general staff, chief of defense, General Komchuk. And the Ukrainian military, again, has been fighting the Russians for 6 years now. And they're pretty proud of themselves, and they are enthusiastic. And so the line of contact between the Russian-led forces in Donbass and the Ukrainian military has shifted back and forth. So one of the things actually that President Zelenskyy is trying to do with the Russians in the Normandy format is to have disengagement along that line at several different places along the line. But that makes the Ukrainian military nervous, because in previous times when there was any indication that the Ukrainian military would pull back a little bit, the Russian-led forces would take advantage of it and they would move forward. So when President Zelenskyy says, look, we got to take some risks in order to try to come up with an agreement on Donbass, his military said, look, boss, we tried that before and they took advantage of it. And when there were attacks by the military during a ceasefire, for example, by the Russian military, the Ukrainian military would be ready, locked and loaded, to fire back and to hit back really hard, which would then have the potential effect of stopping, of destroying the ceasefire, or the reduction in violence, as we're. And so all to say that Zelenskyy, Zagornyuk, the defense minister, and Komchuk, the general, the chief of staff of the armed forces, had to restrain the military. Had to exercise real control to keep them from firing back right away, from opposing this disengagement in these various places. So right now, in the current leadership, it's in pretty good shape. But we'll see. There's a cabinet shuffle that is coming up, and it makes me a little bit nervous on this thing.
You mentioned the word Crimea twice.
Yes.
Has everybody written it off
No.
completely?
No.
What is your view on it?
My view is that Crimea is Ukraine. The Ukrainians' view is Crimea is Ukraine. The Russians think that this is settled policy, that they don't want to hear any more talk about it. Secretary Pompeo, to his credit, has told Lavrov that you may think it's settled. I don't think it's, Secretary Pompeo, I don't think it's settled. You will recall that when the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states in the early 40s, Sumner Welles issued a declaration from the State Department saying, we, the United States, will never recognize the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states. And Secretary Pompeo, in the summer of 18, did the same thing. He said the Pompeo Declaration, and it says, we, the United States, will never recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea, and we'll keep the sanctions on. There are Crimea sanctions, and there are broader Donbass sanctions and other sanctions. And he said, we will keep those sanctions on until Crimea is returned. Now, no one expects that there will be, the Ukrainians don't expect, no one else in the world thinks that there's going to be a military solution to Crimea. That's just not going to happen. what may happen over time, over probably a long period of time, like in the Baltics. It took 50 years, but the Baltics are now free and members of the EU and members of NATO. Ukrainians don't want to wait 50 years, by the way. They hear me say that and they say, yeah, but 50 years is too long. You know, Crimea is Ukraine. But it takes time, and as Ukraine succeeds, defying President Putin, but if it succeeds in economic terms, political terms, European terms, there is the chance that the Crimeans will say, you know, we'd rather be with Europe than with Russia. So, short answer to your question, no, we haven't given up. The Russians would like us to, but we haven't and shouldn't.
David Holloway here at CSAC. So my question in a way is a follow-up. So you define success for Ukraine as kind of economic prosperity and political stability, democratic political stability. And that's the best riposte or the best answer to Russian policy. Right? So I'm interested to get your sense then of what the embassy in more specific ways is doing to help Ukraine, what your assessment is of the likelihood of that outcome given internal tensions, I mean, oligarchs and what have you in Ukraine, and how much coordination you have with the EU countries on this. Is this a concerted and combined effort, since I think that's the outcome everyone wants, right, apart from Russia, I guess?
I think that's right. I think that's right. Certainly, in answer to the last part of your question, which leads into the first part of your question, the EU and the G7 nations. So in Kyiv, the G7 is playing a big role. It's playing a very active role, and this I understand kind of varies embassy to embassy around the globe, and it varies to some degree here as well. That is, it's not entirely clear that this administration is putting a whole lot of effort into the big G7 work. But in Ukraine, it's a very tight-knit, well-established group. It's G7 plus the EU, and meet regularly with Bogdan and now with Yermak. Bring in people, the ministers. We had the head of the SBU, the security services, in to talk to the G7. And we try, the finance minister is coming in. It's a very well informed and very focused group. And it's the ambassadors. It's not the staffs, although they'll participate, but it's the ambassadors who are paying real attention to that, and they work closely with their capitals. But and we, exactly what you say, we coordinate the message. The messages. Can't always get it. There have been reform efforts. For example, one of the big pieces of reform was on the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had 200 justices, 200 justices of the Supreme Court. And so the reform proposed was to reduce that from 200 to 100, down to only 100. And the Ukrainians who wanted to do that, they said, well, look, the Americans have 9 or 12 or whatever we're going to, that's all right. It's a small number. And so but the Europeans were struck by the caseload that the Supreme Court has. The Supreme Court is a little different. I mean, just to be fair, I mean, you can bring things to the Supreme Court much more easily than you can here. But the case log, and so the Europeans said, oh, we can't reduce it from 200 to 100 because the backlog will continue. And we said, no, all to say that there are disagreements, but the general approach of economic reform, of political reform, of rule of law reform, of judicial reform is supported very strongly by the international community. In answer to the first part of your question, will they succeed? It's less us. It's much less us, even with the Europeans, than the Ukrainians, and they can do it. They absolutely can do it. So Zelenskyy and his first team, that may be changing, I worry, but the first team was able to get things done despite these challenges from the oligarchs, despite the challenges from Putin, despite the kind of lack of support in some cases from the international community. But they can do things. They can succeed. You know, they got an IMF agreement. They're about to do land reform. So again, you know, Ukraine is one of 5 countries in the world where you can't buy and sell land. You know, with Zimbabwe and I don't know, Venezuela, North Korea, there are probably 1 or 2 others. And yet 80% of Ukrainians don't want that bill to pass. They don't want land reform. The IMF does. The IMF wants to do that. So that's a big challenge for him. We'll see if he's able to kind of, you know, go against the wishes of a whole lot of Ukrainians to get an economic reform that will be good for the country. There's no doubt it will be good for the country, economic growth. And that's why the IMF wants to do that. But they can do it. They've got the political capability to do it. They have smart people that understand it. The Minister of Economy is good. The Minister of Finance is good. The IMF gave them this seal of approval. And money's pouring in, investments now pouring in kind of bond purchases, not yet in investment, not yet hard investment, but the economics are they can do it. Mike, you got to run. Yeah, good to see you. See you tonight.
See you, Beth.
Back there?
Here?
Yes. The red shirt there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. My name is Daniel. I'm a student here at Stanford. Thank you so much for coming out here. It's a wonderful talk. I'm curious from your time as ambassador under the Bush administration to your time as acting ambassador in this administration. With the exclusion of the invasion of Crimea, how has Putin's policy towards Ukraine changed? Were there any major differences? And if so, what motivated these different change?
So from both the Russian side and from the Ukrainian side. So when I was there before, as you indicate, so I was there from 2006 to 2009. And that period was interesting politics. I mean, it was real politics in Ukraine, and regularly the presidential elections would flip. There'd be a president elected from the east, and the next time the president elected from the west. You know, you went from Kuchma to Yushchenko, and Yushchenko back to Yanukovych, and Yanukovych back to Poroshenko, and now I don't know if you call Zelenskyy from the east or not, but he's from the southeast. Anyway, well, I'll say it was real politics. It was not violent. It was, you know, it was substantive in some sense. I mean, the question of NATO membership was real and debated. And the language issue was real and debated. You know, orientation toward Russia or orientation towards Europe, real and debated. And when I got back last year, those debates had moved into the background, and there was more unity in Ukraine than ever before. So Putin's invasion. And Steve has made this point over and over, and I footnote him right now. Putin has done more to unify Ukraine than any Ukrainian leader in history. He has, it's not to say that all Ukrainians now are fully on board on the government in Kyiv, although Zelensky's got a pretty good rating. But it is true that that invasion, that illegal annexation of Crimea, the invasion of Donbass, has unified Ukraine in a way that I didn't see when I was there before. Now, if the other part of your question was what's changed on Putin's side, I think that he woke up at one point in the fall of 2013 when he saw under a Ukrainian president that he thought he had some influence with, you know, Yanukovych. And Putin saw this guy headed for Brussels about to sign an association agreement with the EU. And he woke up and he said, whoa, that's not going to happen. And so he bribed Yanukovych with $15 billion and low gas prices. Yanukovych said, okay, sounds good, turned around, came back, didn't sign. People in Ukraine went to the streets and were in the streets all winter, and that led to the Revolution of Dignity. So I think what changed on Putin's mind was he saw Ukraine was moving towards Europe, and he wanted to stop it.
You might not want to answer this, but
A good leadoff. A good leadoff.
Moving right along.
but as someone who's seen the sweep of American history from so many vantage points, from Vietnam and Iraq, and then this most recent circus that we all witnessed, as someone who also believes we have to protect our institutions, how much is the threat right now to our institutions? Because not only people like Fiona are gone, but it seems like anybody who touched this issue and waved the red flag about the aid has been purged. John Rood is fired. Good people that we all worked with are gone. People coming into the intelligence community seem to be of the view that it's actually Ukraine who is doing a lot of the mischief. So from the vantage point of, is this a 4-alarm fire, a 1-alarm fire? You're here on Super Tuesday when a lot of us are voting. I'm just curious, and just a related question, something I get asked. How can you be effective as a diplomat, particularly when you're talking to people, these are life and death issues, and you're in the room with people whose lives are on the line, representing the United States of America with a policy process that is coordinated and you're doing your job as a professional, when you have no idea if your legs will be yanked out from underneath you from one day to the next. So the effectiveness of a diplomat, the power of an American handshake these days, the threat to our institutions, just where do you kind of rank it, given all that you've seen in terms of this time?
Want me to answer this? Excellent question, an excellent question. So there may be something, Brett, about Ukraine that may be a little unusual in that there is general agreement, as I said earlier, on the importance of their effort to be independent, to be sovereign, to be European, which has, again, motivated Republicans and Democrats over the years, which I think continues, which I think is still there. And again, the evidence on the security assistance, all the way up to the very top, and in the end, including the very top, agreed that this was important to do. So in Ukraine, you've got that history, you've got that that consistency of policy over time that gave me, even though I was a little bit concerned about what was going on in Washington, gave me confidence that the overall, the regular channel, the policy that came out of the regular channel, supported by the Congress, supported by the administration and previous administrations, was not threatened. My only question to Secretary Pompeo was, would that be threatened? And he said it wouldn't. And so I was confident to accept. But so with regard to Ukraine, that regular channel held on. And it's actually Mike's question too about why haven't these people been replaced? And why is it slow? Is it chaos, or is it conspiracy? And or do they just not want something to happen? Is that so? Your question about the 4-alarm fire is a good one as a threat to our institutions. And what threatened the regular channel, the institution of foreign policy that focused on Ukraine, but focused on Syria and others as well, is trust and some degree of transparency. That is, I had to know what the conversation, I in Kyiv had to know what the conversations were. And the regular channel was outside of my visibility. So that transparency just wasn't there. And that generated distrust. So those two things, challenge, threaten this institution of foreign policy making and implementing that you were smack in the middle of on all these things, which makes us worry that the institution is challenged. And it can be fixed. And if it's just a matter of getting around to appointing these people, then we'll see. we will see that it is just a matter of getting around the border, and they will do it, and we'll be back on track. We'll see.
The gentleman in the yellow tie there, who I'm going to guess is a West Point classmate by his tie.
An easy one, jumping back to economics. What do you think the impact of the Russian gas pipeline is going to have on the Ukrainian economy?
Well, so Nord Stream 2 is this gas pipeline coming from Russia to Germany, which, as I say, would go around Ukraine. So it will cost Ukraine $3 billion a year if it's completed. Ukraine will have a hard time. I mean, the whole IMF program is $5.5 billion. So $3 billion a year is serious money for Ukraine. So it would have a big effect. Another indication of this bipartisan support for Ukraine is last fall, the Congress, House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly supported sanctions on the last company that was going to complete that pipeline. And last I heard, that pipeline is not completed, and they still haven't laid that pipe. And that Swiss company that was laying the pipe has left and is not, and the Russians say they're going to have to construct a new, they have to build new pipe-laying ships to do this. That's going to take some time. Anyway, so I'm hoping that, and by the way, answer to your question, when that happened, when the Senate passed that sanctions bill provision in the National Defense Authorization Act last fall, the Ukrainians were able that very weekend to strike a deal with the Russians that they wouldn't have been able to do had the pipeline gone through. Had the pipeline gone through, the Russians wouldn't need to have the deal, the gas deal with the Ukrainians, which they had to strike. So the Russians agreed that they would continue to push gas across Ukraine, $3 billion a year, maybe a little less, because of those sanctions. The sanctions gave the Ukrainians the ability to strike that agreement, write that contract with the Russians that is going to keep them in that game, at least temporarily. Yep. There's a patient guy in the back. All right, okay, all right, very good. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Back to the other sort of vulnerability that you brought up, which is their kind of interference in our process, our electoral process. I agree that we should try to encourage our citizens to be as informed as possible, but the reality is that the Russians' efforts target the people who really are never likely to be terribly curious. Certainly, and that's a lot of Americans. To what extent do you see Facebook as really bearing some responsibility for the effects of all of that? It's sort of they're enabling to some extent. I think most people would say, okay, maybe it's a benign force, but it is a reality. And so, what is Facebook's or social media's responsibility? Let's be more general. And what can be and should be done about that to blunt what the Russians are clearly able to do?
So here I am, this poor ex-diplomat trying to answer your question about something I know very little about. That is social media. I'm not even on Facebook, so I don't even know what this is. Nor are you. Okay, very good. So, I think my own view, it's just a personal view, and it's not a very well-informed view, is that individuals have responsibilities in this case. And that's why I go back to kind of an education thing. I don't give up yet on a lot of these people who you say will never be willing to take a look at other views. But in terms of some smarter person in this room, maybe it's Steve, about Facebook that I defer to, but I don't know if you.
Not on Facebook either.
No, they're very good, very good. So here, three of us are not even on Facebook.
Yeah, Tom Finger here, FSI, but pretend I'm Zelenskyy.
Yes.
Coming to you for what do I do advice. In our electoral turmoil, good time to do things, bad time? How do I prioritize how I want to interact with the United States? Make Ukraine a campaign issue? Let the Americans sort it out and work on the Europeans and domestic? What do I do for the duration of this campaign?
President Zelenskyy, let me tell you the answer to that question. You should do what's right for Ukraine on each of those things that you mentioned. You should push to try to get the Russians out of Donbass. You should push to defeat corruption. You should try to bolster your cabinet. And one thing you should really not do, Mr. President, is get involved in our politics. You should recognize that your most valuable strategic asset in Washington, D.C. Is bipartisan support. And you, Mr. President, should not do anything to jeopardize that bipartisan support. You should stay out of our election totally, and will stay out of your election. And I think that if he's got a job to do, and he cares, of course, about support from the United States, and he cares support about the Europeans, but he, more than Poroshenko, is focused on domestic Ukrainian politics and domestic Ukrainian challenges, and those two are the big ones that he needs to focus on. That is the war and the fight on corruption. And that's my advice to you, Mr. President, is stick to those. Don't worry about us. We'll be there if we can.
Fred,
what steps should be taken to establish deterrence with Russian cyber operations that fall below the threshold of the use of force, or is it even possible?
Yeah, I think it's possible. And I've been encouraged to read, as we all can, this is in the press, that the U.S. government and elements of the U.S. government have taken some aggressive steps, even proactive steps, to challenge the hackers in St. Petersburg or wherever they are, by sending them, those individuals, messages. And they say, the message that these individual hackers in St. Petersburg are getting from U.S. government agencies is, we know who you are. We know where you live. Do not do this because it will be bad for you. And maybe that's having some kind of an effect. That's one thing that we can do, and I'm encouraged by. Well, I don't know. What do you think?
I'm just an undergraduate.
All right, that's okay. That's all right. That's all right. That counts. Undergraduates count.
We didn't discuss the downside if we don't support the Ukraine. And I'm remembering, as you do, the domino theory. And I'm thinking of the Baltic states and how some of the tactics that worked in the Ukraine might work there. Could you talk about the downside?
Sure. So I went out to Ukraine in 2006, and in the spring, and in that time I went around and talked to smart people about Ukraine. Talked to Steve, talked to others. I had the opportunity to talk to Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he answers that question in a broad sense. And he says, in a geostrategic sense, if Russia is able to dominate Ukraine, which is what we should oppose, but if Russia is able to dominate Ukraine, Russia will become an empire again. It'll be the Russian Empire. It won't, and there'll be no way, Brzezinski argued, that Russia will ever be a democracy, because they will have to impose such draconian measures to control Ukrainians and others, which they are doing now, that it destroys the chance for a Russian democracy, which we'd all like to see. And the opposite, he says, is also true. That is, if Ukraine does make it, and if Ukraine is independent and is moving toward Europe and is a normal European country, then Russia can't be an empire. And that Russia has the possibility of becoming a normal country in Europe as well. So I think there's a lot at stake. I mean, there's that Ukraine, as I say, is on the front line of a lot of these battles, and that's one of the big battles.
Yeah, on this question of the Russian appetite for acquisition of neighbors, hegemony and neighbors. There was some talk about Russia and Belarus recently. Have you followed that?
Only generally. Steve probably, I'm going to ask Steve for his views on this, but when Mr. Putin's trying to figure out over the last couple of years probably how to stay in power, which is obviously what he would like to do, one option is to form a new union, a new country, by absorbing Belarus. And then there would be a new constitution, and this constitutional prohibition against a third term wouldn't apply to him because it'll be a new country and a new constitution, so he could stay in power. So people were concerned about that. There's a plan B right now, which I think he may have gone to, which is to change the Russian constitution to put in place new offices, that's right. Some of which he would control more easily without actually being president, and giving less power to the president, more power to the party. But Steve, you've thought about this.
Alexander Lukashenko wants to be president of Belarus. He doesn't want to be governor of Belarus in a unified Russian-Belarusian state. So even though they signed a union treaty back in 1996, I don't think Lukashenko is interested in it. And I'm going to give myself the last question, last short
Steve.
question. Looking at what Russia has done to Ukraine over the last 6 years, I would argue that in effect, Russia's desire to bring Ukraine back, that's no longer an option. I can't see a Ukrainian political leader today who say, we're going to give up on the West. We really want to go back to Mother Russia. And I'm about 95% sure of that.
I'd be 99% sure of that.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. That's the question. I wanted to just check.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Because I think that then, though, the result is that Russia now is on a plan B. And that plan B is, as you said, to prevent Ukraine from becoming a successful state, because it's not the model they want to have for the Russian population and such. And then that gets back to, I think, our differences. Let me just draw you out. Last question.
Yep.
The replacement of Surkov, who was the Kremlin's point man on Ukraine up until about a month ago, with Dmitry Kozak. You seem to be a little bit more optimistic about that than I am. So,
thank you.
On why.
Thank you. Great to have this opportunity on that. So, guy, just for those people who've never heard of Kozak or Surkov, Surkov has been responsible in the Russian government for Donbass. He selected the leaders, the Russian leaders, and the other leaders that have led those two little statelets, these little unrecognized statelets. So Surkov is kind of the architect of that whole Donbass policy, which, as I said, I think is failing and is a loser for Putin. And I think Putin's trying to get out of that. And would like to find a way to get out of that. Surkov has been the person responsible for that loss, or that loser, for that burden. And if I'm right, and I give myself less than 50-50 chance of being right, but if I am right, and Putin has decided he wants to kind of cut his losses, Donbass, and has gone to another man. His name is Kozak. And Kozak is the one I may have mentioned earlier, who is working with Yermak, the Ukrainian, and it was Yermak and Kozak who struck this prisoner release that was so popular when the 24 sailors came back in Ukraine. So the story plays out. The story I would tell is Putin sees Donbass as a loser. He sees Surkov as responsible for that losing. He says to Surkov, this we know, what he said to Surkov, you're out. You have said he'll come back, or others have said he may come back, but nonetheless, Surkov is now out. Kozak has been given that responsibility for Donbass, And Kozak has a record of deals, Moldova, prisoner release, and it might be, I'm hoping it is, and there's some indication that it is, that there is a chance to have the Russians get out of it. But, and you're right, no Ukrainian leader will give up on either Donbass or Crimea.
I hope you're right.
I hope so too.
Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you all.